Hello everyone. In this session, I am going to talk about behavior therapy and behavior modification. Behavior therapy and behavior modification have been used in the past to refer to almost any practice that alters human behavior. We have to understand that behavior therapy does not entail brainwashing or mind control. Practitioners who use behavior modification do not use psychosurgery or electroshock therapy and only occasionally use drugs as a temporary adjunct to a change procedure. Behavior modification involves structured learning in which new skills and other behaviors are learned, and at the same time undesired reactions and habits are reduced. The use of behavior modification motivates and encourages the client to move towards the desired changes. Both the experimentally based behavior therapy and behavior modification focus on increasing the desired or wanted behavior and removal of the undesired or unwanted behavior in the client. At the end of my talk, you will be able to understand the characteristics of behavior therapy and appreciate the principles and procedures of behavior modification to change socially significant behavior with the goal of improving some aspect of a person's life. Let us now see the characteristics of behavioral therapy. The first characteristic feature is focus on behavior. Behavioral therapy procedures are designed to change behavior, not a personal characteristic or trait. It de-emphasizes labeling. For example, behavior modification is not used to change autism, but to change problem behaviors exhibited by children with autism. Behavioral excesses and deficits are targets for change with behavior modification procedures. In behavior modification, the behavior to be modified is called the target behavior. Next, the procedures are based on behavioral principles. Behavioral therapy is the application of basic principles originally derived from experimental research with laboratory animals. The scientific study of behavior is called experimental analysis of behavior or behavior analysis. The scientific study of human behavior is called the experimental analysis of human behavior or applied behavioral analysis. Next, we emphasize on current environmental events. Behavior modification involves assessing and modifying the current environmental events that are functionally related to the behavior. Human behavior is controlled by events in the immediate environment, and the goal of behavior modification is to identify those events. Once these controlling variables have been identified, they are altered to modify the behavior. Successful behavior modification procedures alter the functional relationships between the behavior and the controlling variables in the environment to produce a desired change in the behavior. Next, we involve precise description of behavioral modification procedures. Behavior modification procedures involve specific changes in environmental events that are functionally related to the behavior. For the procedures to be effective each time they are used, the specific changes must occur also in the environment. Next, treatment implemented by people in everyday life. Behavior modification procedures are developed by professionals or paraprofessionals trained in behavior therapy. However, behavior modification procedures are often used by people such as teachers, parents, job supervisors, or others to help people change their behavior. People who use behavior modification procedures should do so only after sufficient training. Next, measurement of behavior change. Behavior modification emphasizes on measuring the behavior before or after intervention to document the behavior change resulting from the behavior modification procedures. In addition, ongoing assessment of the behavior is done well beyond the point of intervention to determine whether the behavior change is maintained in the long run. Next, de-emphasis on past events as causes of behavior. As I stated earlier, behavior modification places emphasis on recent environmental events as the causes of behavior. However, knowledge of the past also provides useful information about environmental events related to the current behavior. Lastly, rejection of hypothetical underlying causes of behavior. Although some fields of psychology, such as Freudian psychoanalytical approaches, might be interested in hypothesized underlying causes of behavior, it rejects such hypothetical explanations. I will now talk about observing and recording behavior. One fundamental aspect of behavioral therapy is measuring the behavior that is targeted for change. Measurement of target behavior or behaviors in behavior modification is called behavioral assessment. Behavioral assessment is important for a number of reasons. Measuring the behavior before treatment provides information that can help determine whether treatment is necessary. Behavioral assessments provide information that helps in selecting the best treatment. Measuring the target behavior before and after treatment allows the determining whether the behavior changed after the treatment. Now, let me tell you about conditioning. Respondent conditioning is a learning model in which one stimulus, as a result of being paired with a second stimulus, comes to elicit a response it did not elicit just previously. Usually, this new response is similar to the response previously elicited only by the second stimulus. In this model, the first stimulus is called the conditioned stimulus, and the response it comes to elicit is called conditioned response, while the second stimulus is called the unconditioned stimulus, and the response it already elicited is called unconditional response. For example, take the case of a child who is gradually developing a dislike for school because the teacher emphasizes the use of corporal punishment, which makes the child anxious and fearful. This will be the first reason for the child to develop school phobia. In human behavior, most of the things are either rewarding or punishing. Attention, approval, money, good grades are some forms of rewarding, but ostracism and criticism are forms of punishment. These acquire their effect through respondent conditioning and therefore are called conditioned reinforcement and conditioned punishment respectively. In respondent conditioning, there are two ways of dealing with undesired behaviors. The first is extinction, the second is counter conditioning. Now let me tell you about extinction. Respondent conditioning is accomplished by establishing a contingency, that is relationship between the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus. The conditioned stimulus predicts to a certain degree the onset of the unconditioned stimulus. If we terminate this contingency so that the conditioned stimulus is not associated with the unconditioned stimulus, eventually the conditioned stimulus will no longer elicit the conditioned response. This process is called extinction. For example, if a small child is scratched by a cat and hurt, then the child may develop a fear of cats. In this example, the scratching is unconditioned stimulus, the cat is conditioned stimulus, and the hurt is unconditioned response, and the fear developed by the child is conditioned response. If the child now onwards encounters cats without anything bad happening, then the fear may extinguish. Sometimes, following extinction, the conditioned response may gain in strength over time. This is called spontaneous recovery. However, in practical situations, this is usually minimal, and with further extinction, the conditioned response will no longer reappear. Now let us see the procedure for producing extinction. There are basically two ways of carrying out extinction. The first is gradual, secondly it may not be gradual. The gradual approach consists of moving through a sequence of steps called a hierarchy toward the object or situation that elicit the strongest conditioned response. The alternative is to bypass most of these intermediate steps and confront the final situation right away. A variation of the non-gradual approach involves bombarding the person with the anxiety-producing stimuli and or keeping the person in the anxiety situation without any escape. This approach is called flooding. Although extinction is applicable to any respondently conditioned response, it is most used with anxieties and fears. People are continually confronted with situations that elicit some anxiety, such as standing up to the boss, making a presentation before a class, or talking about something personal. If the person can approach and be in the anxiety situation without anything unpleasant happening, then some of the anxiety should extinguish. Let us now see about counter conditioning. Counter-conditioning is the reduction of undesired elicited responses by respondently conditioning incompatible responses to the eliciting situations. The first step is to determine the situations that elicit the undesired responses. As for example, the sight of spiders may cause excessive anxiety in some people. The second step is to determine or establish ways to elicit a response incompatible with and dominant to the undesired response. For example, providing some forms of relaxation towards reducing the spider anxiety. Finally, the mismatched response is conditioned to the stimuli, eliciting the undesired response, as the relaxing stimuli may be paired with the stimuli to avoid the fear associated with spiders. This counter conditioning is continued until the undesired response, that is fear of spiders, has been adequately reduced, usually until it no longer occurs. Counter conditioning is often used to reduce unwanted emotional reactions such as anxiety, anger, or jealousy. Most clinical cases have an anxiety component that leads to be handled in some way. Desensitization is a counter conditioning of anxiety with relaxation. In other situations, the undesired response is a rewarding approach response, as occurs in some aspects of alcoholism, drug addiction, and overeating. The sight of a bar may elicit a craving for a drink, or the taste of one cigarette may lead to smoking another. In these cases, counter conditioning may involve conditioning in an unpleasant or aversive response to the stimulus situations, eliciting the approach response. This is called aversive counter conditioning. Let me now tell you about operant conditioning. Operant conditioning is also called instrumental conditioning. It is the learning model based on the effects of behavior of contingent events and the learning of the nature of the contingency. If the contingent event makes it more probable that the person will behave in a similar way when in a similar situation, the event is called a reinforcer. Let me now tell you about reinforcement. Following the behavior, the contingent event may come on or increase, or the contingent event may go off or decrease. This produces two combinations. The first is positive reinforcement, the second one being negative reinforcement. Positive reinforcement is an increase in the probability of a behavior due to an increase in the contingent event. For example, John, a new manager in a company, began praising workers for submitting their reports on time. In a couple of weeks, this reinforcement by praise greatly increased on-time reports. Positive reinforcement, when appropriately used, is one of the most powerful of all behavior change tools. Negative reinforcement is an increase in the probability of behavior due to a decrease in the contingent event. A person learns to use his relaxation skills to offset anxiety, with the decrease in anxiety being a negative reinforcer. Thus, negative reinforcement is based on the decrease of something undesired, such as pain or anxiety. Negative reinforcement is not punishment. Reinforcement is an increase in the probability of behavior, while punishment is a decrease. Now let me tell you about operant conditioning procedures. We turn to behavior change strategies that are based on operant conditioning. This includes altering the stimulus situations in which behaviors occur, getting desirable behaviors to occur and reinforcing them, extinguishing or punishing undesired behaviors, and reducing the reinforcing effects of events that support undesired behaviors. Let me tell you about stimulus control. Operant behaviors do not occur in a vacuum. They occur more in some situations than others and are triggered by external and internal cues. That is, for all operant behaviors that are stimuli called discriminative stimuli, which tend to cue the response. Discriminative stimuli do not elicit the behavior, as the conditioned stimulus elicits the conditioned response, but rather set the occasion for the behavior, making it more or less probable the behavior will occur. Now, let me tell you about increasing desirable behaviors. The most common operant approach consists of reinforcing desirable behavior, and this should generally be a component of all operant programs, even when the emphasis is on some other approach such as extinction. Now, let me briefly mention about reinforcement. An important point is that we must identify what actually is reinforcing to the person, not what we expect should be reinforcing to him. A good approach to determine the reinforcers is to ask the person what is reinforcing. A variation of reinforcement is self-reinforcement, the reinforcement people give themselves. This may be a form of covert verbal reinforcement or a more tangible reinforcer such as buying oneself some treat. Self-reinforcement is often an important part of self-control processes in which people reinforce themselves for desired behavior. Let me tell you about certain strategies for initiating behaviors. To reinforce desirable behavior, the behavior must first occur. If a catatonic has not said anything for 5 years, it would not be an effective approach to wait for him to say something to reinforce his talking. Thus, an important part of the operant approach is to use ways to help initiate the behavior to be reinforced. There are many ways to do this, including shaping, modeling, fading, punishment, and guidance. Shaping, also called successive approximation, is the reinforcing of behavior that gradually approximate the desired behavior. The key to shaping is the use of successive approximations that are small enough steps so that there is an easy transition from one step to the next. If one is cultivating the ability to meditate for long periods of time, it may not be desirable to start trying to meditate for an hour. An alternative would be to begin at 10 minutes and add 1 minute every other day, gradually shaping meditation for longer periods of time. Modeling involves a change in a person's behavior as a result of observing the behavior of another person, the model. This way of initiating a behavior, particularly with a child, is to have the person or the child observe someone else doing the desired behavior and encourage imitation of the same behavior. A client who is learning how to interview for a job may first watch the practitioner model an appropriate behavior in a simulated job interview. Or a teacher who praises one student for good behavior may find other students imitating the same behavior. Fading involves taking a behavior that occurs in one situation and getting it to occur in a second situation by gradually changing the first situation into the second. A small child might be relaxed and cooperative at home, but frightened and withdrawn if suddenly put into a strange classroom. This fear can be circumvented if the child is gradually introduced to situations that approximate the classroom. Shaping involves approximations on the response side, while fading involves approximations on the stimulus side. Punishment of a specific behavior suppresses that behavior and results in the formation of other behaviors. Perhaps one of these other behaviors is the desirable behavior that can be reinforced. This is not a particularly efficient or desirable approach in most cases, as it may cause negative emotions in the individual such as anger, resentment, or irritability. Guidance consists of physically aiding the person to make some response. Thus, a part of contact desensitization of flooding, the client may be guided to touch a feared object. Guidance may be used to help a client learn a manual skill or help a child who is learning to talk how to form his lips to make specific sounds. A variation of operant procedures is contingency contracting. This is a program in which operant contingencies are well specified and clearly understood by everyone involved. These contingencies, reinforcements, and punishments that can be expected for a different behaviors are formalized into a contract which is often written. Sometimes the contract is imposed on people, but often the best approach is to negotiate as much as possible with all people involved about the nature of the contract. Thus, the role of the behavior modifier is often a consultant and negotiator about contracting. Consistency is a critical aspect of most behavior change programs, while inconsistency can generate many problems. If a parent or teacher is consistent in dealing with a child, the child can easily learn what contingencies are operative and feels comfortable understanding how part of the world works. Inconsistency, on the other hand, may produce uncertainty, anxiety, tantrums, psychosomatic illness, learned helplessness, and related problems. Children and others also engage in rule testing, the intentional breaking of a rule to determine if the contingency is in effect. In some contingency contracting programs, the client is reinforced with tokens that can later be exchanged for a choice of reinforcers. Contingency contracting programs using tokens are called token economies. There are now a large number of such programs in a wide variety of settings. The tokens a person earns by completing his part of the contract are eventually exchanged for a choice of reinforcers from a reinforcement menu. The tokens are often easily dispensed and can be given fairly immediately after the desired behavior. Let me sum up. Behavior therapy involves analyzing and manipulating current environmental events to change behavior. A behavioral excess or behavioral deficit may be targeted for change with behavior modification procedures. Behavior modification procedures are often implemented by people in everyday life. Behavior is measured before and after the behavior modification procedures are applied to document the effectiveness of the procedures. Respondent conditioning is a learning model in which a stimulus situation comes to elicit a relatively new response or increase in response because of association with other stimulus situations. Respondent conditioning is sometimes used in behavior modification to establish or strengthen a response, as in the treatment of enuresis. Undesired respondent behavior is changed by respondent extinction or counter conditioning, both of which may or may not be done gradually with a hierarchy of intermediate steps. Emphasis of operant conditioning is on changes in the probability of a specific behavior in the presence of specific stimuli as a result of events contingent on the behavior. A reinforcer increases the probability of a behavior it is contingent on. A punisher decreases the probability. The contingent event is usually dependent on the behavior and occurs because of the behavior. Procedures to get a specific behavior to occur and to reinforce it include shaping, modeling, fading, punishment, and guidance. Extinction is the return of the probability of a specific behavior towards its initial value after the contingent events have been removed. Use of an intermittent schedule of reinforcement increases resistance to extinction. Punishment as a change procedure should generally be avoided because of undesirable side effects, but it can be used effectively to disrupt or suppress an undesired behavior while a desired alternative is being strengthened. Positive punishment procedures include administering an aversive event and overcorrection, while negative punishment includes a withdrawal or loss of a reinforcer and a period of time during which reinforcers cannot be acquired. The reinforcing effects of an event can be reduced by aversive counter-conditioning or stimulus satiation. Nervous habits can be reduced by negative practice and habit reversal. Behavioral therapy has been applied successfully to all aspects of human behavior, including developmental disabilities, mental illness, education, special education, rehabilitation, clinical psychology, business, industry, human services, child management, sports psychology, and health-related behaviors. Let me sign off now and hope to meet you in another session. Thank you.